Finland was first taken by Russia during the Napoleonic Wars and became an autonomous region with its own senate, diet, money and army. And despite being part of the Tsarist Russian Empire, the Finnish parliament granted suffrage to many. But in the early 20th century, the Tsar tried to Russify Finland in order to end growing separatism. The separatists, or Fennomans, had promoted Finnish culture and independence for decades, but they also contended with 15% of the population who spoke Swedish. Many of these Swedish speakers were Svecomans, who promoted Swedish culture and made up a large chunk of the upper classes. Plus, the Industrial Revolution and the increase in population led to the formation of labour movements, and many went on strike during the Russian Revolution of 1905. Each of these groups had their own political parties. The Socialists formed the SDP, the Svecomans had the Conservative Swedish People's Party, and the Fennomans had the Finnish Party and the Young Finnish Party. During World War I, Finland remained neutral and didn't send troops to the front. However, many Swedish speakers in particular volunteered to fight for the Germans as Jaegers. But Finland still suffered because of the war, as food became scarce and unemployment rose. So in 1916, the SDP under leaders like Oskari Toikoi won a majority in parliament. However, just a few months later, the February Revolution in Russia ousted the Tsar and a provisional government was set up. So the Finnish SDP tried to pass the Power Act, which would have granted most of the powers to the Finnish parliament. But the Russian provisional government disbanded the Finnish parliament and called for new elections. Tensions were high during the elections, and the socialists and middle classes began to organise their own forces, the socialist Red Guards and the anti-socialist White Guards, and they often clashed in the streets. Because of the election, the SDP lost their majority in parliament. However, over in Russia, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution. The Finnish Senate, under an anti-communist called Finnhofud, decided to declare Finnish independence rather than unite with the Bolsheviks. Lenin, who had agreed to self-determination before taking power, agreed, and in December 1917 Finland became independent. But the new Finnish parliament weren't willing to make any concessions to the socialists. So the socialists, who saw parliamentary action fail beforehand, decided to rise up in January 1918. They seized the urban and industrial strongholds in the south and were joined by some Russians who were stationed in Finland. But the Whites under Mannerheim became a credible fighting force when the Jaegers returned to Finland and were joined by many Swedish volunteers. The Reds on the other hand lacked discipline and leadership, and the Whites quickly besieged them in Tampere. After a couple failed assaults, the city eventually fell in April and many Reds were executed. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks made peace with Germany, and Germany annexed a lot of new land, but new states were created. The Germans were therefore free to aid the Whites in crushing the Reds, so sent thousands of troops to Finland in early April. They quickly occupied Helsinki, and the Reds all but crumbled by May, but the Whites continued to persecute thousands of them. But it should be said that war crimes were committed by both sides. Now in control of Finland and backed by Germany, the Whites hoped to create a greater Finland. A few hundred Finnish volunteers marched into Karelia, but the British, who were involved in the Russian Civil War, helped form the Murmansk Legion under Toikoi. They were fearful of a German ally gaining access to the White Sea, so the Finnish Vienna expedition quickly failed. Meanwhile, the Finns were poised to elect Kaiser Wilhelm's brother-in-law Frederick Charles as their new monarch. But in November 1918, Germany surrendered and Finland became a republic, and many new states emerged in Eastern Europe. They sent aid to the Estonians during their war against the Bolsheviks, and in April 1919 they tried to take Karelia once again. The Anas expedition once again failed in a couple of months. But some locals in Karelia and North Ingria declared independence during the Russian Civil War. The Republic of East Karelia survived for nearly a year, but it was invaded by the Bolsheviks, and the following Treaty of Tartu cemented the borders between Finland and Russia. The Finns and Karelians, however, tried once again to unite in 1921, but the 3,000 or so people involved in the East Karelian uprising were quickly crushed. The notion of a greater Finland survived. However, during the Winter War, although Finland managed to defend its independence against the Soviet Union, they ceded some territory, and during World War II they fought alongside the Germans and made plans to annex northern Russia.